thank you for that lovely introduction. I didn't recognize myself, but it's really a pleasure. You're my colleague now since I'm at university. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here to talk about the transformative change assessment and be part of the discussions today, because that is really one of the reasons why I was really enthusiastic about this assessment, not to just write a report that will sit on a shelf, but as an entry point for having important conversations about what we need to do and how. So what I want to do in the next 40 minutes is present the transformative change assessment. This is the first time I'm presenting it to a group of people working on these issues rather than more just general public. So then I want to at the end kind of think through just some insights that come out of it, because in some ways I was the orchestra leader and everything, but I'm always trying to think, we're living through a time right now of rapid transformative change in the wrong direction. And so how do we actually take, an understanding from the literature, from what we know on how do we transform at the rate and the scale and the speed and the depth that is called for by the science? What can we take from this and put it into practice and action? So yeah, I'm just going to walk you through what the assessment is and has done, and yeah, thank you to Björn Olaf for contributing to it. But I think this really was a foundational assessment of the knowledge for transformative change towards a just and sustainable world. So it's not just any transformative change, but really in the direction of meeting the 2050 vision for biodiversity and yeah, just and sustainable world. So it was the first of its kind conceptually and empirically. As we heard, transformations is a very political word. It's, in the IPCC, there were a lot of fights in the fifth assessment where it didn't actually then come into the synthesis report because it was too political in working group 2. So conceptually and empirically, what do we know about it is important. It brings together a broad range of evidence because it is a very fuzzy theme, and where do you draw the boundaries on transformative change? What is it that is, is it psychology, is it organizational theory, etc. And so how do we make, draw the boundaries there? And it was really a unique endeavor that focuses on forward-looking strategies. How do we actually achieve the visions that we have? Because we have lots of examples of transformations that happen, but none of them were as deliberate as what we need today and as urgent. This was a 3-year process preceded by a scoping process I think it's important to mention that the governments called for this assessment, which got me very excited, and that's why I was when asked to be part of the scoping, I was yes, because I think it is something it says a lot when the governments want to know more about this. It involved 101 experts from 42 countries from around the world, and we had a strong gender balance, more women than men, which is not always usual in these, and also a high proportion of social and interdisciplinary scientists. So that means that we had different languages, different understandings, and sometimes we were talking past each other with kind of theories and themes, and that's the importance of having those 62 theories, recognizing that there are many different lenses on this topic. We drew on about 7,000 references, and in the assessment we also assessed 800 visions of what that sustainable world would be, to recognize that it's not just one vision, it's many. We had a database of about 391 case studies that were assessed and analyzed. And as with every IPBES assessment and IPCC assessment, we had review comments, and we had about 10,000 review comments to along the way to guide us into how to think about this. So it really was a collaboration with different areas of expertise, people from diverse contexts. But what I loved was this strong commitment, and people really wanted to have a report that has an impact and doesn't just sit on a shelf. So so the summary for policymakers, I'm just going to point out that the official title of the assessment is probably the longest title we've ever seen. The underlying causes of biodiversity loss and the determinants of transformative change and options for achieving the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Whew. Okay, the transformative change assessment is we structure the summary for policymakers in 3 sections. The first is really, setting the stage that transformative change is urgent, necessary, and challenging, but possible. And that but possible is where we're going. The second is on the strategies and actions for transformative change, because we know it won't just happen in and of itself, that we actually need to do things and do things differently. And then it gets to the question of who. And that in the third section, we're talking about enabling transformative change and roles for all. So this is really like what I'm going to walk you through now is like some of the findings and things. And the starting point, which is a finding, but I thought it was also like for many of us, it is the reason we're doing this work, is that transformative change for a just and sustainable world is urgent and necessary to address global interconnected crises related to biodiversity loss, nature's decline, and the projected collapse of key ecosystem functions, global tipping points, etc. And we recognize in the assessment that, biodiversity loss and nature's decline is the entry point, but we're really dealing with a polycrisis. We're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with pollution, we're dealing with global inequality, we're dealing with mental health issues. It is one big question, and that was always in our mind in terms of like, what is the transformative change that we need? So transformative change, as we're seeing it, is deliberate transformative change for a just and sustainable world. And we recognize that it shifts views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. And this is really important. I'll go into that. But we're recognizing that in the same way that, like weaving together different theories and frameworks and things, we actually need to look at different views, ways of seeing, ways of thinking, ways of knowing. We need to change structures, which are ways of, like organizing, governing, and regulating. And then finally, practices, which are the ways of doing, behaving, relating. So all these ways of being in the world need to transform. But to do this, we have to address the underlying causes. And that, I think, is one of the more important parts of this, because these underlying causes are the deeply rooted and interconnected social and cultural patterns that shape, influence, and reinforce all of the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And climate change would be a direct driver of biodiversity loss. So this is really like that we have to go deeper into, what is it? And the three underlying causes identified in the assessment are disconnection from and domination over nature and people. And that's it's not about just our relationship to nature, but also to people and how we treat each other. The concentration of power and wealth, and the prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. And if you read these, you might be thinking, wow, this looks like the world today, that we are accelerating the underlying causes. And I think that is very much the case of what we are doing. So how do we then actually move in this direction? And this is how our the underlying causes link to the indirect and direct drivers that were addressed and identified in the IPBES global assessment in 2019, when which kind of showed they kind of confounded or put the indirect drivers and underlying causes as synonymous, like these are the same. And we really unpacked that, okay, what do we mean about these values and behaviors? So our underlying causes really are the underlying values and, that are, the worldviews that are driving the changes in the first place. And we recognize, though, that it's not everybody that needs to change. It's important to recognize and strengthen the views, structures, and practices that are working, that are aligned with generating a just and sustainable world, and especially those of many indigenous peoples and local communities. We have generations of knowledge and wisdom on how to actually, work, live in harmony with the environment. One of the case studies that I'm most familiar with is the National Maasai Conservancy in Kenya, which is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems. And in this group, they're doing conservation beyond conservancies. And based on values of National means coexistence. So dignity, inclusivity, self-determination, the empowerment of human rights and things. They work to bring back wildlife, but also to take care of rivers, to adapt to climate change, to educate girls, train people, all outside of the standard model of tourism operator comes in and people are shifted off of the land. So it's really an inspiring example that is being taken up in other areas. So it's a small example that is having what I would call a fractal approach to change. And this brings us to the importance of those values and the principles. And this is, if we want to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, we have to then ground ourselves in these principles identified in the literature as equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and then a more process-based one on adaptive learning and action. And that last one recognizes that there are always going to be unintended consequences of transformations and transformative changes. So we have to think about like, well, we always have to kind of path correct for the unexpected surprises, etc. But if you look at these, the principles of transformative change, you'll see words that are not popular in certain countries right now, and that they're being, deleted and everything. And I think this is also, they go hand in hand with those underlying causes, because they, the concentration of power and wealth is it has implications for equity and justice, and I look forward to discussing these things later. But so in general, the framework we're taking is like the current situation is very much informed by structures, view structures and practices that are influenced by these underlying causes. So what we're getting today is actually makes perfect sense from what is being prioritized in this world. And what we want to do is we want to break this, the constraints of these existing systems, the vested interests, the status quo, etc. And we want to move to this world of where equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and adaptive learning and action actually inform our views, structures, and practices all the way through. So I think that's the that bottom line. But we also know that this is not easy. It's not just about having a framework and changing the world. We also recognize in the assessment that there are challenges to transformative change. And these challenges are pervasive, they're persistent, they're systemic, and they are, as we see, they are very powerful. And the first one is the relations of domination over nature and people. We kind of talk about this from the literature as colonial modernity. Most of these patterns are traced to colonial periods of domination and everything. And that was it was a controversial concept that we had to phrase in other ways in the assessment. Likewise, economic and political inequalities as a challenge to transformative change, very much linked to our economic systems and our prioritization of profit and shareholder growth, etc. So capitalism, in other words, is very much under that. Inadequate policies and unfit institutions is like our governance and the way we've organized society doesn't match the nature of the challenges at any of the scales. So we're struggling to deal with problems that have no borders, problems that are very local, there's a lot of misfits in there. And then, of course, unsustainable consumption and production patterns are holding us back, and that comes down to not just behaviors, but the whole way that we've organized society to be throwaway, etc., and to not take into account externalities of nature. And then finally, limited access to clean technologies and uncoordinated knowledge and innovation systems. So there's a lot of things that are stopping the transformative changes and they're very linked to the underlying causes, so that you can see that there's a perpetuation of certain patterns in society. And then every one of these challenges actually shows up as barriers that are often context specific, and this is there's a lot in this diagram. This comes from chapter 4, but you can start to see that the uncoordinated institutions and policies and ingrained practices and habits and wealth and power shaping policy, buying, governance, etc., that these are showing up in different ways in different societies, and they spread. So how do we overcome the challenges and the barriers? And I think that is one of the important things that we have to, why we're all here too, is going to what Björn Ola showed very beautifully with those graphics, that we have to weave together insights from different approaches and knowledge systems, including indigenous and local knowledge, because that enhances the strategies and actions. So my weaving isn't as nice as your weaving, but it's important to actually recognize that there are so many different perspectives that are taken into account when we approach transformative change, and it really helps us to understand what's missing. Are we actually missing the empowerment dimension? Are we missing structures? Are we missing the the technologies? Are we missing knowledge co-creation, etc.? So this, I think, was really helpful to say that we have a world of ideas and theories and models and subdisciplines, etc. But how do we actually move this use this in practice? And that, I think, is the challenge. What I think was one of the exciting parts of this assessment is often, in the definitional part, we're like, oh, that's incremental change, that's reformist, that's transformational. And what we really, in looking at how change happens, we saw that both small-scale and large-scale changes contribute to transformative change for a just and sustainable world when they address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. So sometimes an incremental change, like just a slight change to subsidies, can move us on a path and make it easier to do more changes and more changes, et cetera. So these incremental changes, the small-scale case studies that we see, are actually part of larger systems changes. And when we get rid of the challenges and overcome the challenges and barriers, then you see that these things can spread very rapidly. And in an analysis of the time frame for changes, we saw that in terms of the number of initiatives, that the majority of them showed positive impacts on nature and society in under 10 years. And to me, that was really promising because, it didn't take long for nature to come back to the National Maasai Conservancy. We saw during COVID, it doesn't take long when you take the pressures off. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. And then moving on to section B, this key strategies that we've identified. And this was very hard because in the scientists, the policymaker says, don't tell us what to do. And then in the drafts, they were like, but tell us what to do. And so they wanted to have the list. But we know from so many reports that we have these checklists of everything to do, and nothing actually really happens in practice. So the idea here is to identify what would the real strategies for transformative change be, recognizing that they're all interconnected, that we need all of them at the same time. So it's not to say let's just focus on strategy 1, conserving and regenerating places of value to nature and people, or strategy 2, driving systemic changes in sectors most responsible for biodiversity loss and nature's decline, transforming economic systems for nature and equity, and transforming governance systems to be integrated, inclusive, accountable, and adaptive. And then the 5th one, which I think is key to all of them, as they all are, shifting societal views and values to recognize and prioritize interconnections between humans and nature. So the idea here is that all of these need to happen, and all of these have associated actions that were identified in the assessment. And I've just yesterday put the actions in because I thought okay, people probably want to know what is it that we actually have to do. But the main theme here is that conservation that involves sustainable stewardship, especially by indigenous peoples and local communities, contributes to transformative change when it's inclusive, when it's well-resourced, when it's focused on places of high value to nature and people, and when the rights of indigenous peoples are recognized. So there is this idea of rights and it's about how we do this. And then the 5 actions here are about recognizing the territories of life for kind of vital biocultural heritages, enhancing legal protection, basing conservation on diverse values, which is linked very much to the IPBES values study, if you're familiar with that came out in 2022, that recognized that we need values that go beyond just instrumental values, but are also taking into a balance with relational values and intrinsic values. Let's see. Let me see if I can... Did I just accept it? Oh, there's a thing here on mine. Okay. Oh, maybe I can just ignore it. It says, yeah, never mind. But it's in the way. Anyway, let me go back. So strategy 2 is transformative change in sectors that heavily contribute to biodiversity loss, including the big ones like agriculture and livestock, fisheries, forestry, infrastructure, mining, and fossil fuels, are crucial and urgent for advancing global sustainability, delivering societal benefits, etc. So the actions related to these really are focusing on those sectors that are most responsible. And all of them are, very much... part of many economies in the world today. So how do we switch those, especially at a time when we see a backlash and the prioritization of very destructive activities in these sectors? So regulating direct exploitation of organisms, embedding technology in transformative frameworks, financing for global sustainability, and supporting civil society initiatives become part of this strategy. The third strategy is about transforming dominant economic and financial paradigms so that they prioritize both nature and social equity over the private interests. And in this figure here, you see that, the amount of, in terms of global GDP in the trillions of dollars, the amount generated by sectors moderately to highly moderately dependent on nature is enormous. And of that, we're really actually, we're subsidizing in the wrong direction, and the amount of money financing that goes towards protecting biodiversity and nature is about 0.25% of that GDP that is dependent on nature. So we're really not going in that, we're not putting very much money in, but the report is not about just adding more money to the pot. It's about changing the economic systems, the structures, the financial mechanisms and things. So it's not just we need a monetary fix, but we need to actually change the systems themselves. The fourth strategy is inclusive and accountable and adaptive governance systems. And these play a pivotal role in driving transformative change because they involve diverse stakeholders in decision-making and in addressing governance challenges. So how do we actually strengthen biodiversity-related values in governments across sectors? How do we engage diverse actors in inclusive governance? How do we secure collaboration and accountability through multilateral governance? And how do we strengthen learning through informed, accountable, and adaptive governance that recognizes diverse knowledge systems? So all of these then are part of then how do we change the way we govern in that? And part of that then comes to strategy 5 in terms of shifting dominant societal views and values to recognize human nature and interconnections. That is then a powerful way, is to actually see that, wow, nature isn't just something out there. We are nature. We are, how to get that. And here we have, 5 actions that are to increase that recognition of that is, through shifting cultures, through new narratives, through changing social norms, and especially regarding production and consumption, facilitating transformative learning, not just in normal formal education systems, but for adult learning, for everything. And that's where, the role of national parks, and there's a lot of ways that we identified to go beyond formal schooling, and then co-creating knowledge and weaving diverse knowledge systems in. And again, you'll hear me saying that again and again, and I think it's really important because, English is very much like subject, object, humans, nature, that we see ourselves very much as separate. But a lot of the authors come from cultures where they go we don't even, in Japan, we don't have that same way of thinking about nature. So I was in charge of the glossary. So we were how do you make a glossary exciting? Well, you bring in different languages. You bring in, to say that this has to be part of the language here. So you can see, the different languages of Satumaya, Ubuntu, all of these in there. And this is, to go from relations of domination to relations of care, that we're ecocentric, pluriversal formations based on autonomy and reciprocity. It's not like we have to invent it. It exists. It is alive in many cultures. It is alive in there. And there is a lot of knowledge in that, but there's a lot of wisdom. And when we, for those who are not allowed to use the words of equity and inclusion and things like that, we have other words that we can borrow for this. And I think this is really important to recognize, is that it's not just the words we're using, but it's the meaning behind it that makes a difference. And so this brings us then to okay, what is that vision of the future that we're aiming for? And so visions, which are narratives and stories, or about the desirable future states we want for people in nature, including for Mother Earth, are often shaped by these values and worldviews, and they often include very goals and intentional efforts that will make us reach those states. So in the analysis of these positive visions, we included a lot of things like the gift economy, the donut, all different types of well-being economies, different ways of organizing society that will benefit nature. And here we saw that shared positive visions and their development can inspire transformative change when they recognize these socio-ecological dependencies, the agency of non-human life forms, and also an ethics of care. So there are different qualities, and we emphasize, that these visions have to be co-produced. They can't just be thrown on people. So the 2050 vision for biodiversity is agreed upon in the global biodiversity framework, but how do we get buy-in from people so that they can see that their visions are aligned with these visions? And that brings us then to transformative change being system-wide. And so to achieve it, we need a whole of society and whole of government approach, which is in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but it has to engage all sectors and all actors in visioning and contributing collaboratively. So it's not just that this is a science policy thing and we give this to the governments and say, please do this, because that won't work, but it's really about how do we actually activate that sense of agency and responsibility in all different sectors and actors. And I think this is where, you know, the roles for all comes in. And we recognize that governments are powerful enactors of transformative change. There's no doubt about that, and there's no, you know, like there's that has to be part of the transformative change. But they're powerful when they foster policy coherence. And coherence is like being based on the whole, and incoherence is when it doesn't make sense. And when they enact and enforce stronger regulations to benefit nature's contributions to people in policies and plans. This is like regulations, taxes, fees, tradable permits, etc., across different sectors. When they deploy innovative economic and fiscal tools, when they take the risks and try different things, and I think this is what we're, you know, like where governance has to step up and meet the challenge of transformative change by doing things differently, by collaborating differently, and very importantly, eliminating, phasing out, or reforming environmentally harmful subsidies, which, in other words, we are actually contributing to, you know, we're investing in the problems and not the solutions right now. And then finally, promoting international cooperation. So these are the list of like, okay, this is how governments can do this. And this is where I think in a time of crisis, as we'll be hearing about later, that we do need to step up and think about, you know, how are we going to do this? And civil society is stepping up. Civil society organizations are actively around the world advocating for protecting biodiversity and nature through transformative change. So there are calls for this. There are millions of people on the streets right now. And so we know that transformative change is supported by protecting civil society initiatives and environmental defenders that are facing violence and rights violations, being, you know, where activists are being targeted as being terrorists in that language, when people are actually being, you know, like losing their lives. And we've documented, I think, about 2,000 people having lost their lives, especially women and people from indigenous and local communities have been that. And we have, like, for example, this map that just shows the importance of social movements as in challenging the drivers of biodiversity loss around the world. And it's very hard to like pull out the different things, but you can see a lot of them actually had like regressive outcomes. They were smashed and, you know, and stopped. Some of them just created reformist changes, but some of them were actually transformative. So we want more triangles on this map. We want more groups, but to do that, we need to protect civil society as well. And that's a challenge when you get, that's the importance of democracy and the challenges of autocracies. And this brings in then the business sector. The IPBES is doing an assessment of business and biodiversity, which will be finished this year. But we were also looking at, you know, like that relationship between well-designed policies and business and private sector initiatives and tools, and the financial and economic incentives that influence socioeconomic development. So they have to go hand in hand. Like the business sector and governance sector actually need to work together to support transformative change. And from people that I've talked to, there's always a who's going to go first in this, and that's, I think, to find that the way of collaborating and partnering is going to be really important. So I've flown through the assessment in half an hour, and I just want to start thinking about like how do we, you know, like where do we take it from here? You know, do we just kind of say like, okay, that was the assessment, that's done, and some of the you know, like thinking through the take-home messages that we want to reiterate is important, because it's like, first we want to recognize that we have to address the underlying causes of biodiversity, that's really important. We know that we need principled strategies and actions. They can't, you know, the values that we hold and share, not just for ourselves, but for everyone, actually make a big difference, because again, we are seeing transformative changes played out very rapidly. And if you can imagine just for a second, what if we had rapid transformations that were based on equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, reciprocal and respectful. Could we actually have a dramatic change as we're seeing right now, but in the other direction with a whole different quality? And I think that's something we're thinking about, because that's what we are calling for in the assessment is taking the urgency seriously. And we recognize then that it results from small scale and large scale changes, that it is, it's not just about let's get this to the UN and the UN Secretary General will call for the quantum leap and then we will all, that's not how it works. So it is going to be every little, initiative on the ground, etc. And then recognizing roles for everybody in enabling transformative change, not just thinking someone else is going to do it. And that means then that how we communicate this assessment, how we communicate our science to people, and going out of the academic bubbles and things to really inspire and engage people with, from where they're at and what they care about deeply, and then trying to move that. So that is kind of what the goals are. And so, before, just to kind of wrap up, I've been thinking as we're writing up papers and things. So what are kind of some of the insights that go from beyond just the key messages that were government approved, and that is this in this? And I'm trying to I always retrofit things into my own way of thinking and everything. But I think a lot of this is about potential. That transformative change can have positive impacts on all dimensions of the poly crisis. So it isn't just about global environmental change, but if we actually address the underlying causes of nature's decline and the barriers, then we actually address multiple problems, because we wouldn't, equity and justice for people, for nature, for future generations actually would be very much tied into what we're doing now, what we're doing differently. And again, principles comes out. The direction and the quality of transformative change makes a difference. And that's something we say directly in the assessment. It's not just about the size of change. It's not just about the speed of change, but it is the direction and the quality. And principles, values, and visions are foundational to the transformative changes that we need. So we need to look for those and look what is it that is, behind every policy, every practice, every paradigm. And so that, to me, also is something that comes out. And then in terms of process, thinking in terms of process philosophy, that it's not just about pushing transformative change to 2030, 2040, 2050, but it's about starting right here and right now, and then recognizing that what we do in these little increments, how we have our lunches today, how we do this, is actually contributing to transformative change. Through language, through meaning, we are actually connecting with with these larger changes. So it's an ongoing process of shifting these pervasive and persistent social and cultural patterns, repatterning society. And as creatures of habit, that's not always easy, and with vested political interests, that's not always easy. So all of these insights are very political. And then it's about how do we create synergies. I love that this is future Earth oriented, and that that there's so much collaboration here. And I'm thinking, in Norway we can collaborate, but how it's not that we all have to do the same thing, but we need to align so that there is no single vision or pathway or way of doing it. It's going to always be very concept specific. But if it does align with these principles, if it does address the underlying causes, then it actually can amplify, and we can promote and amplify these changes much easier. So it's not about the cookie cutter approach or trying to find everyone to do the same, but it is really to recognize the context specific strategies and actions that work together and have a much bigger influence than they all alone. And then again, it's not just about what to do, the checklist of do this, but it's also about how we do these things. And there are roles and scopes for all peoples, communities, and organizations, but it goes into, it's not, and I see this, we probably see this in projects, in departments, in institutions, that when we're all working for transformative change and we get in our own way, we kind of stumble upon each other because we're just trying to do things rather than think about what is the process? How are we treating each other? And so the microcosm and the macrocosm really come out very much in that. But, you know, activating agency, individual agency, collective agency, political agency is going to be essential right now, and especially when people are feeling very despondent about the role. And this brings us then to impact, and getting to the main point is that transformative change is possible. It can be promoted, it can be amplified, and it can be scaled. And our case studies from around the world show that rapid and positive impacts are, you know, can be realized within a decade. And this brings us, I think, to, you know, the conversations that we can have today is that we have the knowledge and the wisdom that we need to scale change right now. And the question then is, like, how do we put that into practice, especially at a time when people are using the knowledge that we have on transformative change, but without the principles, and they are making changes that are very rapid. They're changing, you know, they're the urgency, and this is what we're seeing in the world today isn't just random. It is very much a shift in views, structures, and practices that doesn't really care about the future for people and nature and living in harmony with nature. And so those are the things that, and I think that, you know, like, how do we actually take this knowledge and bring it into politics? How do we actually address power? How do we actually, like, start to, like, step up and use this when it is also very dangerous? You know, like when, and we were lucky that this was approved at the IPBES plenary in December. It was approved in December, and the U.S. government shifted then. And we recognize that, you know, like, this is the moment where it's a timely moment for the assessment to come out, but it's also important then that we have these types of conversations and spread it and support transformative change. And how do we do that? And this is my last slide, our second to last. But it is that we included what we call, like, the practical user guidance that kind of walks people through, because we saw in our review comments and assessments, like, this is so abstract. This is so, you know, like, that this is like, how do we actually use this in our projects, in our initiatives? What are the takeaways? And so we kind of walk people through with almost like a little list of, you know, okay, what is the project? What are the values? What are the underlying causes? What knowledge are you drawing on? What are you missing? And we're working on making this into something that is usable by communities so that they can actually challenge the, you know, like use the knowledge in different ways. We're going to make the cards so we can have the transformative change, you know, like card game and things. And this is the, you know, how to go from science and policy to practice is where we need to, you know, go that, because we know that what we do is actually going to make a difference for the future. So if you haven't read the summary for policymakers, you can download it here. It is one of the things, and I think Bjørn will recognize this, is that we really emphasize making a shorter report. So the chapters are going to be coming out this year, but we ask the authors, instead of doing 150 or whatever pages, to do, you know, 8,000 words, 10,000 words, really make it concise and put other stuff in supplementary material. So we want you to read all 5 of the chapters and then engage in the conversations that I think really are going to make a difference. So I am going to just stop there, and I really look forward to the conversations about this, like this as a starting point for critically approaching transformative change for a just and sustainable world. So thank you very much.